Hello everyone. I played my first large-scale tournament at Washington, D.C., going 6-1. My first opponent is Shun. I lead Toxicroak and he leads Skuntank. Since I have the lead advantage, I anticipate him to swap out immediately, so I try to react by pulling out my switch screen. He does not switch out immediately, allowing me to get to the Mud Bomb, and I use it immediately to either burn a shield or feint the Skuntank. He ends up shielding it, and he has some energy loaded up on the Skuntank, and he swaps out the Venomoth, and I swap into my Venomoth, but he does have a confusion advantage, I believe. Um, and in this matchup, whoever uses the charge ability first ends up losing the mirror match. And I learned this later on in the tournament, probably after this round, actually. He uses his Silver Wind, I end up shielding it, and I use a Silver Wind back. He ends up shielding it as well. And right here, we basically trade Venomoth. Um, and also, when both Pokemon faint like this, whoever brings in the Pokemon first typically is in a bad situation. So I swap into Toxicroak 'cause I knew I had a charge move almost ready to go. So I bring him in and use Mud Bomb, which should be super effective against him. And he does take it because he has no shields. And since I farmed a fair amount of energy off of his Toxicroak, I end up shielding because I feel like I can feint the Toxicroak with my counters and then have Mud Bomb ready for the Skuntank when it comes back out. And he brings the Skuntank back out, and I use the Mud Bomb, and that allows me to win game one of round one. Going into game two, I decided to switch up my lead going into Venomoth, and just like I was talking about earlier, whoever uses the charge move first ends up losing the mirror match, and I end up learning my lesson here. I was thinking that he may switch, um, and since my bar went to yellow first, he has probably a better IV on his than mine. I end up shielding the Silverwind, and then I use a Poison Fang for whatever reason, trying to bait out a shield with a lower energy move. He basically caused my bait, and I'm put in a bad situation because both of our Venomoths fainted at the same exact time. However, I'm at a shield disadvantage. And if I hit excellent on the Poison Fang, that may have killed him, but who knows. So he brings in his Azumarill first. I made a mistake and swapped in Toxicroak when I wanted to bring in Tentacruel. So I swapped in Tentacruel, which is a hard counter to Azumarill. I was expecting him to swap out, but he stays in this matchup for whatever reason. In this particular matchup, all you have to do is acid spray them and then just beat them down with poison jabs. And he may not have been familiar with Tentacruel's moveset or didn't know that it would take such a short period of time to get to acid spray. Maybe he thought I was going for the sludge wave, but he ends up shielding the first acid spray and he swaps out to his Toxicroak. And at this point, I'm in kind of a bad situation because I swapped out earlier, so I can't swap to my Toxicroak to counter. So I just try to make the best of the bad situation by using my Acid Spray. And he threw his lead by shielding again, so now he has no shields, and I'm going into with Toxicroak against both Pokemon who are both Acid Sprayed with a shield. So at this point, all I have to do right here is to shield this. I could either farm the Toxicroak a little bit, or I can just fire off the Mud Bomb. And I end up getting a couple more counters before using the Mud Bomb. That way, I go into the Azumarill matchup with a bunch of energy. And my goal is to try and get to the Sludge Bomb as quick as possible, and then one-shot the Azumarill. And I am able to get to that situation, and I do use the Sludge Bomb, and that allows me to secure round one. Going into round two, I'm up against John, of course, and I lead Azumarill, and he leads Tyranitar. And in this particular matchup, Azumarill is favored just because Bubble is doing a lot of damage, and Tyranitar can do a bunch of damage back to Azumarill if it lands the Stone Edge. So as long as I shield that, I should be in a favorable position. I was anticipating him to swap out because he was in a bad matchup, but he ends up staying. And I was anticipating the swap out, but um, since he stayed, I just ended up using the Ice Beam anyways. And over here, uh, if I shield the Stone Edge, I should be in a favorable position, and I end up shielding it. So we both have no shields, and I do have an HP advantage over him. And he swaps into his Toxicroak, and I swap into Venomoth. And these Confusions should do a lot of damage, and I don't really mind if he uh, uses any charge ability on my Venomoth because it's not going to faint it, and I should be able to just Confusion it down. And here I expect him to bring back Tyranitar, and he does, and I try to get the Silver Wind off, but I am not successful in doing that. And if I landed Poison Fang, I may have fainted him, which would have put me in a better position. Or if I was able to get the Silver Wind, I would also be in a good position. And right here, I'm forced to burn a second shield because it could have been the Stone Edge, which I was a little worried about. Um, so put in a position where I'm up against a Venomoth, and similar to earlier, Venomoth will beat Toxicroak pretty hard. And I just try to get any charge move off before the Toxicroak faints. So, and now I'm at a shield disadvantage, and he has a Venomoth with a lot of energy, so he's able to hit me with his Poison Fangs. And if I didn't shield the Toxicroak, or for the Toxicroak earlier, I may have had a better matchup here. And he shields my Ice Beam. I'm not sure if I could have gone to a second Ice Beam. And he takes game one. Going into game two, I expect him to lead Tyranitar again because he seemed to have some success last round with it. So I led with my Toxicroak, and at this point, I'm in a really bad position because he does have the lead advantage. So I swapped to a softer counter first, if I can get there. I swapped to Azumarill, hoping he would swap out immediately, but he stays in. And at this point, as long as I shield two of his Poison Fangs, I should be able to beat it in the head-to-head. So I let the first one go through, and I fire off the first Ice Beam. And if he shields this, that's fine with me because I would like to be in a shield advantage in this matchup because I have Frostlass in the back. And I know I can get to another Ice Beam, so I guess I didn't shield, which is fine because I have Frostlass in the back, so I should be able to farm with her. And luckily for me, I am able to get to another Ice Beam before Azumarill faints. So this will either force a shield or allow Venomoth to faint. And at this point, I have two shields against his zero, and I have Frostlass to hard counter the Venomoth. So I expect myself to bring in Frostlass. And I do bring in Frostlass, and I am farming away with a Powdered Snow, and I made a very bad switch into Toxicroak. It's just a preemptive switch. If I stayed in with Frostlass there, I could have gone to the Shadow Ball and then basically one-shot the Toxicroak, and I would have been in a very favorable position in this match. However, I reactively switched when he did, which put me in a very bad position because I needed this Toxicroak later on in the matchup. So even though I won here, he still has the Venomoth, and the Venomoth is able to chunk my Toxicroak down. And all I have left is a Frostlass with some energy and a couple of shields. But after this Venomoth faints, he ends up bringing in his Tyranitar, which counters my Frostlass pretty hard. And basically, I had no chance here. And he ends up taking game two in round two, and this is my only loss in the tournament. So, well job to John, of course. Going into round three, I'm up against T Forgery, and I lead Azumarill, and he leads his Dustox. And in this matchup, I am favored to win, but I do have to shield the Sludge Bombs just because they do so much damage. And I was surprised with how quickly he was able to get to his charged ability here. I fire off the first Ice Beam. My objective throughout this entire tournament is to lead with Azumarill usually and try to get like a shield advantage. And then that way I have Pokemon in the back that would be able to just fire off whatever charge ability that they want. So here I shield the Silver Wind because I expect it to be the Sludge Bomb. Um, and he is able to get to the Sludge Bomb before I'm able to get to the second Ice Beam. And here it's like a hard decision to either shield or not shield. And I end up shielding here because I really wanted Azumarill to survive. And I use the second Ice Beam, and he ends up shielding as well. And I felt like I needed Azumarill, so I was trying to swap out at the opportune moment to absorb his charged ability. So right here, I swap into Frostlass last second to absorb his charged abilities, and both these should be not very effective damage, so it allows me to save a shield, and I am able to farm just a little bit with Frostlass. So he brings in his Quillfish, and I try to bait the shield using the Avalanche. Um, and as you can see, I am swiping like a maniac because if you're sitting directly in front of someone in one of these tournaments, and if they kind of take a peek at your hand motion, sometimes swiping a straight line versus in a big wacky circle might throw them off, thinking that you're using a shadow ball. So he is able to get to his Aquatel, fainting my Frostlass. And I bring in Tentacruel because Tentacruel does counter Quillfish. I am able to absorb both his poison and water type charge moves, and he hits me with the Acid Spray, which is fine. And in a no shield situation, Tentacruel wins a lot of matchups because Hydro Pump does a lot of damage. So I use the Hydro Pump, and it does a large chunk of damage to Frostlass. And he is able to get to the Shadow Ball and basically one-shot my Tentacruel. And I use my Azumarill to feint the Frostlass, and now I have charge ability that I can just use straight onto his Quillfish. And I am able to take game one of round three. Going into game two, I decided to keep a similar strategy as before, leading Azumarill, and he leads Quillfish. And this matchup, Coldfish does have the advantage. However, Azumarill is able to get to a couple of ice beams before fainting, and most of the time they will shield one of them, allowing me to gain the shield advantage throughout the rest of the match. So here I am able to get to the ice beam, and I knew he had acid spray from the last matchup, so I'm not really threatened to shield anything. So I let the first charge ability go through, and it is acid spray. And I am able to get to the second ice beam here. However, he is able to get to his first. So he's going to hit me with an Aqua Tail, and then I'll use the ice beam. And just like every charged ability that I do in this tournament, I'm swiping like a maniac, even though I can just do easy swipes across the screen. So here, he doesn't shield it, but his Pokemon is very low. And I end up shielding this because I know I can get to an Ice Beam on the next Pokemon that comes in. And I also wanted the lead advantage. So he brings in his Tyranitar, and I tried to greed and get to the Play Rough. However, I was not fortunate enough to do so. And I didn't really have an answer to Tyranitar, so um, I basically brought in my Tentacruel, see if I can whittle it down, try and bait a shield with Hydro Pump possibly. And I really need Tentacruel to survive since my last Pokemon had no chance against the Tyranitar. And here I just went for the Hydro Pump just to see if he thought I was baiting with Acid Spray, allowing me to turn the game around. Unfortunately, he conservatively shields, which would be the correct move here. And he's able just to beat down my Tentacruel, and then the Tyranitar will basically do a lot of damage to Frostlass, especially with the shield. So he ends up taking game two of round three. Going into the final game of round three, I decided to switch it up a little bit. I realized that I needed a lot of Tyranitar counters on my lineup since having Azumarill was not enough. So I ended up leading with Venomoth, which has a favorable matchup against a lot of poison typing on his team. And I am able to just beat him down with Confusions. And I knew Aqua Tail wouldn't do a lot of damage or Acid Spray, but I ended up shielding this because I wanted my Venomoth to be pretty healthy going into the next matchup. And I know I should be able to beat it down with Confusions before he gets to another charge ability. And if he brings in Tyranitar, then I do have the Silver Wind to force his shield. And he brings in Tyranitar. And immediately swap out into Toxicroak. And he does swap out to his Dustox, which puts me in a bad position. Um, but luckily for me, I was able to beat down the Tyranitar to half HP. And here, I just use a Mud Bomb, which chunks the Dustox down a little bit. And afterwards, I can bring in both my Venomoth or Azumarill here. Um, they both have an evenish matchup, but since I had a bunch of energy stored on my Venomoth, I decided to bring it in and hopefully burn down his shield with Silver Wind. And I am able to burn it down. And then I've tried to get to the next Silver Wind, and luckily I do with a very low amount of HP left on the Venomoth. And at this point, he is farming my Venomoth down, which is why he's using both of his shields. And my remaining Pokemon is Azumarill, and I know he has a Sludge Bomb ready. So at this point, I either shield it or assume that he is trying to bait me. So very courageous move over here to let that go through because any Sludge Bomb would basically one-shot the Azumarill. Um, and since I correctly called his bluff, I am able to shield here. And I try to farm up a little bit because I know I'm going up against the Tyranitar next. And I feint Dustox without having to use a charge ability. And I'm able to use the Play Rough to feint the Tyranitar, allowing me to win round three. Going into round four, I look at his lineup, and he has a lot of Pokemon that Skuntank has a favorable matchup against, and I'm also afraid of the Charm user, so I end up leading the Skuntank, and he leads his Venusaur, and I should have the advantage here because my uh, Poison Jab should be doing neutral damage. Um, he ends up getting to his charge ability, and Skuntank is pretty tanky, so I decided to let this go through. And I farm up a little bit more and then try to bait the flamethrower and end up using the crunch instead. And he ends up shielding, which is good for me because I am able to get to another crunch soon, and that's why I end up shielding here. So he uses his second frenzy plant, and I get to the crunch, and crunch should fade him. And he decides to let his Venusaur go because he expended all of his energy earlier. And now he brings in Muck, and these poison jabs from Muck shouldn't be doing too much damage. And I know he either has Acid Spray or Dark Pulse. And my Skunk Tank is just going to faint here, so I'm just trying to do as much damage as I can before Skunk Tank faints. And I am able to get to half HP. And here I bring in Venomoth, because Venomoth will do a lot of neutral damage against the Muck. And the first charge ability, they typically like to Acid Spray, a lot of Muck players. But sometimes it's better to use the Dark Pulse immediately. And it might be arguably better to not run Acid Spray at all and either run like Gunk Shot or Sludge Bomb just because everyone is anticipating Acid Spray coming out first. Um, and here I end up using the Silver Wind, knowing that my Poison Fang isn't going to do much damage. And I use the Silver Wind, and I do get the buff, which is luckily a good thing. And try to swap out, but I'm having difficulty timing the swaps in between confusions. I get to the Poison Fang, and knowing that my Tentacruel hard counters Azumarill, I just try and swap him in and beat it down with Poison Jabs. And in this matchup, Tentacruel versus Azumarill, Tentacruel wins so hard that you essentially do not have to shield anything from Azumarill, and you'll be in a huge advantage, and you'll see that play out later on in this tournament. And Tentacruel here allows me to win game one of round four. Going into game two, I felt pretty comfortable with my lineup from last time, so I decided to just switch up the lead and run the same team. And over here, I go up against Azumarill, which is an unfavorable matchup for me, but I am able to chip it down a lot with my Poison Fangs. Um, so I anticipate him to use his charge ability, and I try to swap right away. And I am able to absorb his Ice Beam with the Tentacruel, which allows me to save his shield. And he is in a bad matchup, so he swaps to his Venusaur. And at this point, all I have to do is just whittle it down. I do contemplate on using a shield just because I am really close to the acid spray. But I do end up taking the frenzy plant. And luckily for me, the frenzy plant doesn't faint the Tentacruel, and I am able to get to the acid spray. And this allows me to bring back my Venomoth. And Venomoth will have a good time farming the Venusaur. However, I end up using a charge move. I could have just farmed it down because it was whittled with acid spray, but I guess I was afraid of it getting another charge ability to hit my Venomoth. Even though the Frenzy Plant or Sludge Bomb would do very little damage to Venomoth. So here, I decide to just try and chip down Azumarill as much as I can with the Poison Fang, and I do another great swap to absorb another charged ability here because Ice Beam should not do much damage to Skuntank, whereas it would do a fair amount to Venomoth. And he reacts by swapping into his Toxicroak, which is a very favorable matchup for him because the counter does a lot of neutral damage as well as the Mud Shot or Mud Bomb, sorry, will do a lot of super effective damage. And I am able to bait out a shield from the Toxicroak. And here I have two shields on the Venomoth, so I can just freely use my shields. And since this is a favorable matchup, I am able to farm the Toxicroak. And I decided to shield again because I knew that his Azumarill used all of his energy before swapping out. So I should be able to get to another Poison Fang against the Azumarill. So we experienced a little bit of lag. He should have swapped out by now or brought his Pokemon out. And I do use the Poison Fang immediately. Um, Fortunately, I got a great. So I hit him with the first Poison Fang. And then I am able to get to the next Poison Fang before he does get to the Ice Beam. And right here, he tried to shake my hand in the middle of the charged ability, which would have resulted in me losing the game, possibly, if I didn't get great or higher. Um, but I am able to win this, allowing me to secure round 4. Going into round 5, I'm up against Clouder Chowder. And this game, I decided to lead the Skunk Tank. She leads the Drapion, and she does have a favorable matchup here because her charged abilities do neutral damage to Skunk Tank, whereas mine are all resisted. So I decided to stay in this matchup just so I can just chip it down as much as I can. And I didn't really have too much of a use for Skunk Tank here. She uses Aqua Tail, and I get to Crunch. And she ends up not shielding it. And then I am able to get to Crunch before she can get to her next charge ability. So this should either force a shield or let her stay in, and she does end up using a shield here. Um, I decided to swap last minute to Azumarill to try and absorb any charge ability that she would send out. Surprisingly, her Drapion had Aqua Tail and Sludge Bomb instead of Aqua Tail and Crunch. And since I didn't shield this charge ability, I took a large amount of damage on my Azumarill. So she brings in her Azumarill, and here I just have to whittle this thing down as quickly as possible because I don't really have too much of an answer with Skunk Tank being so low. So I use the first Play Rough, and I do have a little bit of energy built up from the Drapion. And I use the next Play Rough. And she also lets this go. And here she ends up using her charge ability, and I end up letting it go through. It is debatable whether or not I could have gone to another charge ability, and I don't know, probably should have shielded that. I thought my Skunk Tank had more HP, so I brought him in next, but he was very low. Since I had a bunch of shields, I might as well just shield with my Frostlass here. She does use her Play Rough. I try to farm the Azumarill as much as possible before using the Avalanche. Um, and either this will bait her shield, which it does, or possibly feint the Azumarill. She is able to get to her charge ability before I'm able to get to my Avalanched, and I end up shielding this here. Unluckily for me, I hit the Avalanche right as she hit hers, so I end up burning my charge ability on her Azumarill here when I could have farmed it up a little bit more going into the matchup against Venomoth. I would have been able to hit 2 avalanches against the Venomoth. Unfortunately, I used all my energy on the low HP Azumarill, and she ends up taking game 1 of round 5. Going into game two, I was confident that my lineup was able to beat hers. I just had to play a little bit better. And here, it's my Azumarill against the Venomoth. I do have the lead advantage. I try to get to the Ice Beam before she gets to her Poison Fang, and she uses her first charged ability. And here, I'm surprised that she went with Silverwind, which kind of gave me a tell that she may not have a Legacy Venomoth, and she's either running Silverwind and another move. And at this point in time, I was not familiar with third move she had. She switches out into Drapion. I switch out into Skuntank. I probably could have just stayed in this matchup because Azumarill had a favorable matchup. But I decided to swap to Skuntank because Skuntank had somewhat of an even matchup, even though it loses here in the head-to-head. And I just try to chip down the Drapion as much as possible. So I go with the Crunch. She ends up shielding it. So at this point, I have a shield advantage, which is a good position for me to be in, especially when I have Frostlass. And with Shadow Ball and Avalanche, I'm able to basically wipe the board. So here, I decided to maintain the shield advantage and just let the Drapion whittle down my Skuntank. And almost get to the crunch. Fortunately, she is able to feint me right away. I swapped into the bulky Azumarill because I know the bites won't do a lot of damage. And I ended up shielding here just because I had enough energy for a charged ability and was afraid that I would get hit by the Sludge Bomb again. So she brings in her Azumarill, and in this mirror match, just hit as many play roughs as possible. And I was kind of worried that I would lose this too, just because my Azumarill is such low HP, and she is able to get to another charge ability, I'm sure. And I am able to get to my play rough first. So I do use the next play rough, and she does get to her charged ability. And I swap immediately because I did not want her to farm as many bubbles against me. And I just decided to go for the kill, essentially, with the Shadow Ball. Fortunately, she's able to get to her charge ability first. And similar thing happened as the last time she used her charge ability, and I wasn't able to farm it. And I ended up using the charged ability right after hers. So now I'm in a position where I don't have a farmed up Frostlass going into the Venomoth matchup. However, I am able to get to Avalanche before she is able to get to her Silver Wind, and I'm able to squeak by with this matchup and narrowly take game two. Going into game three, I felt like Skuntank wasn't doing enough for me, and and she was also leading her Drapion a lot. So I ended up leading Toxicroak, knowing that I have a favorable matchup. She immediately swaps to her Venomoth, and I respond with the Frostlass. And here I do have a very favorable matchup. So I use the Avalanche, and I completely forgot that she had a non-Poison Fang Venomoth. So I thought I could just absorb any of her abilities, whether it be Poison Fang or Silver Wind, but she hits me with the Psychic, which completely caught me off guard and feints the Frostlass. And I'm basically forced to bring in Azumarill because Toxicroak has no chance against the Venomoth. And my objective is just to take down the Venomoth as quickly as possible. And since I knew her two moves, I didn't have to shield this because I knew neither of them would do a lot of damage to Azumarill. And she does hit me with the Silver Wind, and I do get the Ice Beam off. And she will either shield this or let her Venomoth faint, and she decides to let her Moth faint. She brings back her Drapion, and I know I have a favorable matchup here. I try to switch out, and I go straight into the Mud Bomb. And it is super effective, so this will force her shield unless she wants to let her Drapion faint. And she swaps out to her Azumarill, and since her Azumarill has no shields, I wanted to go straight to the Sludge Bomb, which will do a lot of damage. And I'm able to hit it excellent, and it does chunk down Azumarill a fair amount. And since I had two shields, and I know I can get to another Mud Bomb, I decided to stay in this matchup. So right here, I just get to the Mud Bomb, and I know that Toxicroak should be able to chip away a little bit more at Drapion before it faints. So I am in a very favorable position since I do have Azumarill in the back with Play Rough. So I end up shielding this just in case it is the Sludge Bomb. She hits me with the Aqua Tail. I go with the Play Rough here. Hopefully it should faint the Drapion with its neutral damage. And it does. And this secures round 5. Going into round 6, I was fairly comfortable leading Azumarill into all of his Pokemon with the exception of Tentacruel. And luckily for me, I win the lead fairly hard since Sableye doesn't do much damage against Azumarill. I'm anticipating the swap, and he swaps into Alolan Muck. And I farm up a little bit more and try to swap out into Tentacruel, but had a couple of failed attempts. And both of these guys, they're doing not very effective damage for their fast attacks, but he does have the Dark Pulse, which will do a lot of neutral damage to my Tentacruel. And my objective here is basically to try and bait a shield if possible, which is why I shield since I am fairly close to the Hydro Pump. And he does successfully bait me with the Acid Spray. And here I decided to go to Acid Spray, see if I can bait him back. And he does not take the bait. But I am able to get to another Acid Spray, which is not going to do much damage anyways, but lowering his Alolan Muck by or defense by 4 stages allows my Venomoth to come in and uh, farm it up a little bit. So he does try to farm and swaps out, bringing in his Venomoth. And here I have an Azumarill with a lot of energy, as well as Venomoth, which would just trade with the with his. And I decided to bring Venomoth in, and I know that whoever uses the charge ability first will lose the matchup. So all I had to do was shield and then continuously use Confusions against it. He does use Silver Wind, probably hoping for a buff. And now he does have two shields, but I know his Alolan Muck has no HP, and I know that Sableye is coming out. So try to bait the shield, but its poison typing does not very effective damage, and I get a great swap to Azumarill and try to bait a shield with Ice Beam, and it does work. And he swaps into his Alolan Muck, and Dark Pulse doesn't do much damage, so it's most likely going to be the Acid Spray because he is depending on his Sableye to faint my entire squad. And I farm his Alolan Muck off a little bit more. And at this point, I don't really have to use the Play Rough to faint the Sableye. I can just keep using Ice Beams, and that should take him down. So I am going at him with my fast attacks, and he has no shield. And Power Gem is the only charge ability that Sableye can do, which would do a fair amount of damage. But he does go with a Shadow Sneak, and I do get the Ice Beam off, which will allow me to secure the first game. Going into game two, I decided to stick with the same strategy and lead Azumarill again. This time he leads his Azumarill, um, and he should have charge move priority. So I know I may have to get out of this uh, matchup sometime after whittling it down with as many play roughs as possible. So he does get to the first play rough, and I use my play rough. And I'm trying to swipe like a maniac to make it look like a ice beam, but he doesn't shield it. So I tried to swap, failed the first time, but I am able to get it the second time. And I do decide to shield this because play rough will do a good amount of damage to Skuntank. And I try to chip him down with a bunch of poison jabs. He stays in this matchup. Um, Not sure if he's trying to swap out or not, but I am able to get the crunch off before he's able to swap out. And he ends up shielding this just because he's really close to his charge ability. Um, and at this point, I wanted to maintain the shield advantage. And he does hit me with the Ice Beam, which allows me to beat it down with poison jabs, but he swaps out. And he goes into his Venomoth, and Skuntank is uh, does fairly well against the Venomoth with the crunches. So I hit it with the first crunch, and Venomoth is just farming up, but he realized that if he doesn't use a charge ability, then I may threaten the Venomoth with my poison jabs. So he ends up using Silver Wind, which was quite surprising, and I end up feigning his Venomoth with mine, and I have an energy advantage, and I know he has a low HP Pokemon in the back, and he brings in his Azumarill, and I do get off the Poison Fang, which is good for me. So he either has to shield this or just let his Azumarill faint, and he decides just to let it faint. So he brings in his Tentacruel, and Confusion does a lot of damage to his Tentacruel. And I try to bait a shield with Poison Jab, or sorry, Poison Fang, and he does take the bait. And I swap into my Azumarill just because it had some Energy Sword. End up using the Play Rough since it just does a fair amount of damage. I probably could have just stuck with the Ice Beam and tried to fire two Ice Beams off, but I had a Venomoth in the back, which would do a lot of damage, and I wasn't as threatened. So I ended up using the Ice Beam here, allowing me to win round 6. Going into the final round, I'm up against House Stark, and in this match, I decided to lead with Venomoth because it had a fairly good matchup against all of his Pokemon, with the exception of Sableye. And he ends up leading his Venomoth as well. And here we end up using Confusion to knock each other out. And then both of us end up waiting the 12 seconds to bring out our next Pokemon. And here I end up leading with the Azumarill, and he goes with his Toxicroak. And I am in a fairly favorable position as long as I shield the Sludge Bombs. And here I can't get to my charge moves because Tentacruel is blocking the way. So the only way to get rid of that screen is to let him use a charged ability or swap. And here he uses Mud Bomb, and I decide to respect it because it could be a Sludge Bomb, and I decide to shield that. And I use an Ice Beam to either chunk the Toxicroak or burn a shield, and he ends up using a shield here. And he gets to his second charge ability, and I shield it because it could be a Sludge Bomb, which it is. And I try to farm up a little bit. I should have just went straight for the Ice Beam, but because of that, He makes an excellent switch into his Azumarill, and I end up using all of my energy here. And luckily for me, I had Tentacruel in the back, so I'm able to chunk him down with my poison jabs. And I decided to use my acid spray a little bit late. That way I can get a little bit more energy out of him with my poison jab. And with Tentacruel, he can basically tank all of Azumarill's moves without having to shield. So here I end up using the acid spray just so I can load up on a little bit more energy for the Toxicroak. And he uses his last charge ability before the Azumarill faints, which happens to be the Play Rough. And I'm really close to the Hydro Pump, and I decide to go with the Acid Spray. And House Stark plays a very high risk game here by not shielding this, because the Hydro Pump would have fainted. Um, However, he does call my bait and not shield the Acid Spray. And at this point, he was going to either faint by the poison jabs of Tentacruel or by the bubbles of my Azumarill. So that was a good game one. Going into game two, I decided to switch it up again and this time lead my Azumarill. And here he leads Muck, and even though Muck counters Azumarill, it's not a hard counter just because both of his charged abilities are not really a threat to my Azumarill. So I can basically let Acid Spray and Dark Pulse go, and I should be just fine. And I'm using the Ice Beam here, and I'm able to get out of shield. And neither of his charge abilities are going to do much damage, so I just let him go through. And he uses Acid Spray, that way he can chip me down with his poison jabs. And I am able to get to the Ice Beam. And he lets it go through. And he farms up my Azumarill. So I know he has a bunch of energy loaded on his Muck. So I just have to shield here. Assuming that it's either an Acid Spray or Dark Pulse. And it is an Acid Spray, so I did call it correctly. Um, and I am able to Confusion it down. So I'm sure he was very close to his next charge ability just because he farmed so much off of my Azumarill. And here, since I have a bunch of energy stored up, I'm able to use my Poison Fangs against his Azumarill. And I try to wait for him to use his charge ability. And House Stark is very patient. And he ends up using it. And he hits me with the Ice Beam. And then he swaps out to his Quillfish. And Tentacruel is able to take down Quillfish as well as Azumarill as long as I have a shield. And I go with the Acid Spray, just whittle it down a little bit and try to beat it down with as many poison jabs as possible. And since I have two shields, I may as well expend one of them just so I can potentially get to a Hydro Pump. If not, just use another Acid Spray. Um, and he ends up getting to his charge ability, which happens to be an Aqua Tail, which shouldn't do much damage to my Tentacruel. And I do get to the second Acid Spray. And I am able to chunk it down. Then I swap into my Venomoth, which is able to just one-shot the Quillfish. And then since I have a little bit of energy stored up, I'm able to get to the Poison Fang. And the key thing here is that I swapped out, leaving my Tentacruel in the back. So even though if he does take down my Azumarill, I have a favorable matchup going into um, this final head-to-head. So I do shield his charged ability. Unfortunately, I was not able to get the Poison Fang off with my Venomoth. But I am able to just poison jab it down. And I do get to the acid spray, which doesn't do much. I don't know why I'm doing these crazy swipes, but I am able to feint the Azumarill and win round 7. I'd like to thank Pogo DMV for hosting this tournament. It was a lot of fun and good games to all of the trainers I had the opportunity to play against. And hopefully I get to see you guys in the next season.